Well, hello, everybody. It is my pleasure. No, it is my honor to welcome you all to another FSMA Friday. Right, and this is going to be a great webinar because when it comes to supplier management, we all know there could be some issues, especially when it comes to getting compliance info when we need it. Now, before we meet today's expert speaker, let me just share a little bit about where this series came from for those of you who are new. Now, over about a decade ago, SafetyChain, who developed software to help manage plant-wide processes, detect risk, improve efficiencies, we've partnered with the Acheson Group, who's a global leader in food safety and compliance consulting, to create a way for food and beverage manufacturers, processors, distributors to easily updates, insights, and guidance around changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act. And thus, FSMA Friday was born. Now, this monthly webinar is your chance to not only learn about methodologies and tools that can help you consistently meet FSMA requirements, but you also get to ask questions for our food safety experts who present during the presentations. All right, now let's just breeze through some quick housekeeping. We have muted all attendee mics, but are leaving room at the end for some questions. So please, at any point during the presentation, submit your questions and we'll do our best to get through them all. But if we do run out of time, don't worry. Our speaker will absolutely get those questions and we will follow up with you shortly after the presentation. And yes, we are recording, so you'll get that recording and the presentation slides later today. Okay, let's get on with the presentation. I'm very excited to have back with us Sam Davidson, who carries great admiration for his work in helping food and beverage companies set up and improve food safety programs, whether it be FSMA or GFSI recognized certification or other global standard. Now, he's been an auditor, an instructor, and of course, a speaker on everything food safety and providing best practices. And not only that, he's the only guy I know who has gone dog sledding in the Canadian wilderness. So, Sam, it's great having you back with us today.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. And thank you for that wonderful introduction.
All right, let's dive into some FSMA updates and then we'll get into our supplier management presentation.
Okay, thank you. So just a few updates here. Some you may have seen, some are coming up. The biannual FDA registration opens next week on October 1st for FDA regulated facilities. Just recently, FDA released an informational video on importing seafood. That's on their website. Also, the FDA has issued an updated small entity compliance guide for produce safety regulation. So those smaller entities and produce and how that's going to work for them, again, that has been posted on the website. We are seeing the enforcement of FSMA International Adulteration Rule. Some of our clients and some colleagues and peers have reached out to us and say that they are starting to enforce it. It is they're giving a little bit of not hands off, but a little bit of leeway. You know, as we said here, the initial approach is to follow the educate while regulate approach. I'm sure some people will be surprised if FDA walk in and say, "Okay, we want to look at our intentional adulteration rule." They're going to help you out while they regulate it. So it's not going to be a sudden approach that's going to hurt people. And then October 1st is the reorganization of the Human Food Program. So that's coming up again next week. We will hear more about that, I'm sure, with FDA emails and on their website. So please keep an eye on that and see what's happening. So as Jim had said before, that I'm going to talk a little bit about supplier management. How we deal with it, what's going on with it, and what are the issues that are being seen in supplier management? What effect does poor supplier management have on a preventive control plan, and how we deal with them? We all know now that, you know, under FSMA regulations, you know, there's a greater emphasis on supplier and the supply chain preventive control. So we're going to look at that a little bit. I'm not going to talk about the foreign supplier verification program. That's something a little bit different, and that would take up a whole different seminar or webinar. So we will deal basically with, I would guess, sort of national or local suppliers. Next slide, please, Jim. So a lot of what I'm seeing, a lot of what I'm working with, and TAG is working with right now, and we're seeing across the board, is FDA are coming on pretty hard on supplier programs and the supply chain preventive control. And they're digging in deep into the supplier approval programs and looking to figure out how, as a receiver of these ingredients or materials or whatever it may be, how are we approving these suppliers? What are the criteria that we're using to approve suppliers? Are they robust enough? Sure, we see, you know, we get to the point where in the age of GFSI certification, that, you know, one of the things that people automatically say is, well, they're GFSI certified. I think we all know that GFSI is not the be all and end all. You know, we have seen misses within industry, regulatory agencies, and within GFSI that, you know, we can't always make up for or not always aware of. So we've got to perform our own risk assessment. We've got to ensure that we've got all the right programs in place. We require the right information to ensure that the suppliers are appropriate for our location. Sure, we do ask for the audits. That's one thing. But we also want to maybe perform a questionnaire, send out questionnaires about, you know, things specific to our ingredient or what we're receiving from those suppliers. The audits that you would see, GFSI style or third-party audits, are generally generic and not product or ingredient specific. So you really want to know what it is about your product that you're receiving from them. You want to include things like what's in their food safety plan or preventive control plan, what sort of process preventive controls or CCPs are there, questions around food defense, intentional adulteration. We want to see that those things are there to ensure that they're going to provide information, the right information for us to make the correct judgment. Letters of guarantee are generally something that we expect as well, that we want to see at least annually. And these are areas, and that can get more, you know, we can add more to that. You know, maybe is there gluten regulation? Maybe is there something around animal welfare, ensuring antibiotics aren't being applied to animals? Those sort of things can all be added into the questionnaires, and we can ask for these documentation or this type of documentation. Now, in some cases, and if you're lucky enough, you're in a larger organization, you may have a portal where all that information goes in. That definitely helps. But what we see as well is the lists. Sure, that you know, the supplier approval list will come out, but is it well maintained? We are finding that in a lot of cases now, FDA are finding lists that are incomplete or inaccurate. There may be missing suppliers, or there may be missing ingredients from suppliers, or a mixture of both. So it's something that we have to bear in mind and routinely review. Now, I know in a previous role, I was managing supplier approval program and the approved supplier list, and I had thousands of suppliers I had to deal with. So it's not easy, but it's things that you got to stay on top of and realize that these need to be done, because FDA are looking at it, and they're looking hard at it right now. We're also seeing what we do with our suppliers. How do we manage them? How do we ensure that the suppliers remain compliant? What do we do with suppliers of high-risk ingredients? Now, with FSMA, we know that if it's a high-risk ingredient, then there should be some type of audit for us, whether it is from maybe ourselves, maybe say ourselves as the receiving entity, or maybe you hire someone on your behalf. Maybe someone like TAG can go and have a look at your supplier for you because you've identified it as a high risk. What does high risk mean? In some cases, it could be due to the supplier themselves. Maybe it's the ingredient. Maybe there's a risk, or historically a risk of maybe pathogenic contamination to something. And that's something that you perform during your hazard analysis. I tend to always go back into hazard analysis when I talk about any type of food safety. That's one of your main identification of high risk ingredients or high risk suppliers, performing that hazard analysis. So how do we ensure that they remain compliant? Well, again, if you're lucky enough to have a portal, then something like that can be automatically generated. And it's easy enough for those suppliers to upload that documentation. Sometimes you got to chase them, and that's not so easy. When we look at the requirements for that list, FDA requires a robust list of ingredients and their suppliers, including packaging. Okay, they want to see that ingredient and packaging hazard analysis. So we find quite often that packaging is missing, or there's not enough information or not enough detail put into packaging. I have been looking at a Supplier program just recently, and they had no ingredient hazard analysis and no packaging hazard analysis at all. Needless to say, we're working with them because these sort of things have happened, and we are working with them on FDA to try and bring their programs up to par. One of the things I did notice when I was working on this particular project, they're using a program for managing the hazard analysis, but it hasn't been updated in 3-4 years in some cases. The basic CCP information is there, but the hazard analysis, especially around their suppliers, is not there, and around their ingredients is not there at all. So these are areas that we need to ensure that, as I said, it's robust, as being managed. Going back to the management part, how do we manage them? How do we make sure that suppliers are performing the way they should be? We need to keep a close eye on them as much as we can, and monitoring their say complaint levels, or what's happening with maybe the product type that they make. Is there something in the news? Is there something that we hear of in their industry in general? We need to keep an eye on them and make sure that these areas of risk are being managed. It's not always an easy thing to do, but as part of what we do as food safety QA people, we're always busy. A lot of the time we're fighting fires, but at the same time, we've got to keep an eye on our suppliers as well. It's all very well saying we have a supply chain preventive control and we've got a good supplier approval program, but it's staying on top of it and making sure that it's current, and making sure that we are communicating with those suppliers that are having issues, maybe using a system, a scoring system for your suppliers, around risk, around complaint levels, around volumes, and that sort of thing, to determine whether or not these suppliers need greater attention or can remain compliant as they were or have been. So it's constant. I've used systems before, and I've seen systems before where you've got that traffic light idea where you've got red, amber, green. Obviously, red being the high risk ones where you pay more attention to, but that doesn't mean that you lose sight on the amber or green ones as well. Next slide, please, Jim. When talking about the supply chain preventive control, suppliers now have a greater responsibility in the hazard presence in their products, which is a great thing. Obviously, as a receiver, we want to see that. It sort of passes the buck along to them a little bit. We still have to manage it. We still have to make sure that they are doing the work correctly. If they are saying that if a supplier says they're going to test every lot, then make sure that you get the correct certificate of analysis. Ensure that certificate of analysis is complete and all the correct information is there. And ensuring, as the receiving entity, that you perform verifications on that. So you just don't rely on a COA or a letter coming through, or micro results coming through, you want to verify that as well. And again, depending on risk and what it is you're receiving, you need to perform that verification. I wouldn't necessarily say on every lot. It depends on volume, depends on risk, that sort of thing. But you still want to have at least annually perform some sort of verification against the certificates of analysis, against those micro reports, to ensure that they're doing it, everything's okay. I have seen facilities that have been receiving high risk ingredients, and they get a certificate of analysis with every load. And I asked them about how they verify that. And their verification is just ensuring that the document's there and that it's complete and it's accurate. Now, how we know it's accurate? That's the question I ask. And then people say, well, because it's from a certified lab, it must be okay. You still want to check it, and it is part of the FSMA requirements that you do verify those suppliers, especially the high-risk ones. So I briefly talked about what if an ingredient or supplier is deemed high risk. Well, what do we do? Well, we want to have some sort of annual inspection or audit or assessment outside of a GFSI requirement. Regulatory inspections, as long as they're annual, are acceptable. In some cases, you as the receiver or as the customer will want to visit. Doesn't always require a full-scale audit. As I said before, when you're looking at some of this information, it can be specific to you and your operation. So you want to ensure, you want to have that certainty of safety around your ingredient and what you're going to be using. You want to be able to see if there's a process preventive control or a CCP involved, that it's being completed correctly, it's being verified correctly, that there's a validation in place. So another thing we're seeing is the lack of a good quality validation. Quality is maybe not the right word. Robust validation maybe is a proper phrase. Ensure all that information is there, to ensure it's being done scientifically, to ensure that all the parameters are being matched and what they intend to do is being completed in a worst case scenario. So it's not just whenever things are running well. We want to ensure that those validations are completed whenever things are stretched, whenever things become difficult. Then in the final point here about what if a specialized ingredient only comes from one supplier. In some cases, and I've gone through this before as well, it's a small supplier, a small business that specializes in one type of ingredient or a couple of ingredients that we as a customer or manufacturer need to have this. We can't get anywhere else. And we're using these people because they're great. They produce a fantastic product, but can they afford a robust food safety audit? Can they afford to have GFSI certification? Probably not. So what do we do? In that case, really, we want to have that justification. We want to say to FDA that this supplier is an approved supplier, although they do not have the checks and balances that we would like to have in place. We will then decide or deem them as a high-risk supplier and ensure that there is a independent verification activity or independent audit, whether it's regulatory, whether us as consumers or customers go into that facility. But we want to keep a closer eye on them, I guess. That's the main thing. We can't really punish a supplier because they can't afford to have an expensive audit. So we want to ensure that we are, I guess we want to say it's a win-win, between ourselves as the recipient and them as a supplier. And I've worked with suppliers who have been panicking because they can't afford a GFSI audit, and they've reached out and they will go to whatever length they can financially to try and help. Some cases, a third-party audit, a GMP audit will come into place, and in these cases, then you understand that the supplier is doing the best they can. Sure, you still consider them as high risk because just in general, they do not have the same capabilities as a larger manufacturer. but you understand that they're trying to do their best, and that has to be considered as a partnership. Next, please, Jim. So when it comes to a poor performing supplier, say they were getting complaints from them saying the certificate of analysis aren't coming on time, what do we do? How do we ensure that we can bring them back up to the level that we want them to? I talked about that traffic light system. We would ideally like to have all our suppliers in green all the time. We know that's not always going to happen. But say we have an issue with a supplier, maybe they had a recall, maybe, maybe it wasn't to do with us. Maybe there's complaints coming through from, I don't know, foreign material coming through from the raw material when we are expecting it upon receipt. What do we do? It's not always the job for QA, FSQA to follow up with the supplier directly. And in some cases, and I know in the past I've had difficulties trying to communicate with them and say, hey, hold on a second here. We're having issues here. You're getting towards the amber. You're starting to drop in your ratings. What do we do? It's not always QA to QA that can fix this, obviously, and we expect that the FSQA people at a supply level or our suppliers are going to do the best they can. In some cases, it may be a volume issue. Maybe there's a push from somewhere else, and they don't have that authority or presence to be able to affect change. And that's when we can bring in someone else, and especially someone like purchasing team. If we're facing problems with our supplier, the purchasing team obviously have a lot of authority and a lot of weight behind them when it comes to working with suppliers. And they can just simply say, well, we're going to suspend you until you get these things fixed. So it's a team effort. Not only, as purchasing, they have that power to suspend that, but you've got someone like R&D who will constantly reach out to preferred suppliers, I guess, looking for new ingredients or new flavors or whatever it may be. And if you then turn and say to R&D, listen, we're going to have to stop using these guys for a while because they're not as good. R&D starts looking somewhere else. That can be a loss generator for that supplier, that manufacturer. So they want to ensure that, or we want to ensure that we have that team effort, especially when it becomes difficult, that we reach out to other departments, and it's not just QA ourselves to do that. Again, we can go, and as I mentioned, we can suspend suppliers for a certain amount of time. We can put them on probation periods. We can give them warnings. We can communicate with them as things, or if we start to see a downward trend, we communicate with them about it and say, hey, what's going on? Do we need to meet? Do we need to discuss things? Are you having any issues? Do you need to communicate anything with us? And then always ensure you've got a secondary supplier, right? If you do have to suspend, then what do? You want to have someone there as a backup, or someone you use maybe as equally as the other supplier, but try to ensure that you have that diversification, I guess, of suppliers to ensure that you have a backup in case anything goes wrong. And I guess if you don't, what do? How do you ensure a supplier, if you suspend or lose a supplier, how do you get a new one? Your supplier approval process is there, but what if it's an emergency? What do? What do you have in place? There are going to be minimum requirements, or you should have minimum requirements in your supplier approval program to meet an emergency supply. If your regular supplier, by no fault of their own, has an incident and they cannot manufacture, who do you go to? How do you ensure that they get approval as soon as possible to stop production on your end? And brokers, what do we do with brokers? Brokers are a different entity when it comes to suppliers. The intent of the broker is to get the cheapest possible ingredient or product for you as the customer. And they will have a number of suppliers or manufacturers within their database to use to supply to you. It can be quite difficult to work with brokers and get that information because maybe they have, maybe say you're receiving sugar. Maybe they have 10 sugar suppliers that could provide you. That's 10 sets of approval documents that the broker has to supply to you. Trying to maintain that can be difficult. And it's also difficult for the broker. So in some cases, and I've run into problems before where it has been an issue, and I've had to reach out and use the purchasing department to help me try and get the information needed, because it's a lot of work. Brokers are definitely getting it more now and understand it a lot more now under FSMA and especially under FSVP. But it can be an issue, and I'm not saying brokers are bad. I'm just saying they're a different entity than manufacturing. So there's a different approach sometimes needed when we are using brokers, and just be wary of that. Next slide, please. How do we ensure, and this is my last slide, how do we ensure or keep these relationships? Supply chain preventive control is so important for us as manufacturers. How do we ensure that we are going to better or maintain our relationships with our suppliers? And it's down to one thing. And as far as I'm aware, it's down to one thing: is communication. Now, that's obviously can break out into different areas, but we want to ensure that we establish that objective with our suppliers. What it is we need, what is the information we need, how do we receive this, how do they ship it, all the information around. And this is, again, not just FSQA, but this is around purchasing, around production, around receiving. Get that communication in place first. So, we want it to be a win-win situation for us. We do not want to have suppliers failing in programs or volumes or orders or the requirements needed for FSQA because we haven't communicated that properly. So establish that objective. Develop and share these requirements. Make sure it's clear. We want to ensure that, again, we want it to be a winning partnership. And it's definitely a partnership. So we want to develop and share those clear requirements, develop with them. There may be changes within regulatory concerns and maybe changes within their manufacturing. But we want to ensure that those communications are kept open so we can, as needed, develop those requirements needed. We want to ensure that there is a clear communication path. Depending on your organization, depending how large or small it is, generally within a smaller medium operation, that those communication paths are a lot easier. In larger organizations, not so much. So ensure that we have that clear communication path. Ensure we know who it is we need to contact and have those open communication paths with them. Establish that relationship with those suppliers. Again, I mentioned before that I had worked with thousands of suppliers. I can tell you right now, I did not have great relationships with all thousands of those suppliers, but it's the ones, I guess, that are really that are high risk, that are ones are considered high risk ingredient or high risk suppliers, not by any fault of their own. It could be just the ingredient type. It could be something that maybe has a high risk of salmonella or a prevalence of it. You think of maybe peanuts. You think of maybe you think of chemicals and heavy metals in cocoa or something like that, and for chocolate. So you just want to ensure that you maintain those relationships and have that clear communication path. And then performance reviews. Establish regular performance reviews. Establish regular communication times, not even performance reviews. I've worked with some companies and they have monthly meetings with their suppliers. Great. Fantastic. You know what's coming up. They know what's coming up. If you foresee an uptick in consumption, or if you see an uptick of complaints, the opposite, the good and bad, have those communications. Have regular communication with those. Doesn't always have to be a performance review. You would expect at least to have a regular performance review for high risk suppliers annually. Well, actually, high risk suppliers more than annually. In general, most suppliers annually. The high risk ones, you want to do it more than that. But even just have that check-in, monthly, quarterly. Say, hey, here's what's going on, or do you have any issues? It could be a 5-minute call. It could be an established 1-hour meeting with your team as a company, with your purchasing department, with your R&D department, with those other areas I mentioned, your packaging development people. These are all areas that performance-related issues, if we tackle them ahead of time, then we reduce the likelihood of any potential issues for ourselves within FSQA. So communication, I would say that's my key to better relationships with suppliers. I know we're all busy. I know a lot of time FSQA are firefighting. I've been there. I've done it. If we were in a certain level of maturity, as a food safety operation, then certainly we should do more around that communication and give us that more time to do it. It's not always the case, but I guess in the perfect world, that's the way it would be. Okay, Jim.
We love dogs here at FSMA Friday. And Sam, we love your presentation too. That was I took a lot of notes on that just because when it comes to supplier management, one of the things that we hear all the time at SafetyChain is, when there are shifts in food safety requirements, whether it's FSMA or maybe there's an update to the guidance, GFSI scheme or whatever, something like that. It really does have to cascade down to the supplier level. And how are you going to make sure that your suppliers are able to, and I say able intentionally just because it's, you called out, some suppliers don't necessarily have the resources to be, but how are you going to manage the supplier relationship so that they are, to the best of their ability, abiding by those changes or even current FSMA requirements in this particular case? And to your earlier point about, okay, maybe they can't become GFSI certified, but you can build some type of internal auditing system with that partnership to make sure that you can at least show proof that food safety guidelines are being met. Is there any guidance that you can provide here around, as things do change, and they will always change in terms of food safety requirements? What are some tips to make sure that your suppliers are A, aware of them, and B, doing everything they can to comply with those changes?
I would definitely say that regular and frequent communication with them. As I said, I know some companies will have monthly meetings with their suppliers because of the type of industry they're in. Keep an eye out on FSMA Fridays for any updates that are coming along that you may require to reach out to suppliers to say, hey, we see this coming down the pipeline. We see updates coming from FDA. What do we need to do? Are we covered? Are we good? And it may be a 5-minute conversation, may just be an email, but have that in place just to be aware that you know what's coming up, and they are aware of what's coming up, and vice versa. Maybe they reach out to you and say, hey, are you aware of this? You may want to update your supply chain preventive control program. You may want to have a look out for this, or we're seeing this in the industry. We're not seeing it within with our production yet, but there could be something coming in the pipeline.
Okay, I'm going to ask a technical question. You had talked about an approval list, a supplier approval list, and making sure that it is maintained. Can you get a little more specific around what the FDA, for example, would need to see to be confident that you have a supplier list that is, I guess, in compliance?
So the supplier approval, they will want to see a list of all your suppliers. They'll want to see what ingredients those suppliers are supplying to you. They will want to see a hazard analysis and risk assessment on those ingredients and the supplier. And that may be stuff like Google search on the company. Have they had any recalls in the last 5 years? Performing maybe a Google Scholar search on the particular ingredient. Now, obviously, don't be going to TikTok or Facebook to look up your information online, but look at what it is, that ingredient. Is there anything specific around that supplier or that ingredient that would cause concern and make it a high risk? And if it's high risk, how do you expect that supplier to manage it?
Right.
That's
and when it comes to foreign suppliers, obviously there's a lot of details in the FSMA requirements around that. But where I guess should we be looking in terms of foreign food safety measures versus what the FSMA requirements are, and how is all that combining together?
So we're getting the foreign supplier verification program. But ideally, what you want to ensure that a foreign supplier meets the minimum requirements of FSMA. In a lot of cases, it will be a HACCP plan. And you will want to ensure that that HACCP plan meets all the requirements of your own food safety plan. We want to ensure that there's nothing there that will cause concern or risk or make it a high risk.
Yeah.
We also want to look at the product type. So, for example, shrimp. Shrimp is a product that gets imported a lot into the US from various areas of the world. That product tends to get put on hold a lot for testing or lack of testing, or maybe failure in the certificates of analysis. So then, what do you do? Okay, so and we have done that with companies in India specifically, and work with them and how to look at their HACCP plans, because they wouldn't necessarily call them a preventive control plan.
Mm-hmm.
But we will work and look at their HACCP plans. They will look at their validations to ensure that and their hazard analysis to ensure that they've identified the hazards that we have identified and that we are aware of, and make sure they're controlling them properly using a validated process and ensuring that they're verifying it as in the right frequency.
Right.
And that documentation. And when that documentation is received, there's also that, well, we want to verify that documentation. So if they say a supplier sends us a certificate of analysis that has tested for antibiotics maybe, or they send a lab result from their micro testing, we want to verify that from time to time to ensure that what they're sending us is what we're expecting. It's a verification step like any other verification step that we perform.
Yeah, that was another question. Is you talked about the certificate of analysis and that you need to verify it at least annually, but how exactly do you verify that?
Basically, you get a sample of the product and send it to a lab.
Yeah.
Or maybe you have your own certified lab in house that can test that to say, okay, this is correct. And it depends what you're testing for. Obviously, if it's maybe certain parameters that are you can test in house. We use labs, micro labs for a reason. We don't want to have pathogens growing in our own premises, that sort of thing. We want to ensure that that's all safe. So if you're capable of testing it, then test it in house. If not, send it out to a third party lab and let them test it for you.
Well, I got one here from Salvador. This is a great question. What happens if your supplier or distributor doesn't have a third-party audit and refuses to get one and won't allow you to perform one on site?
And it is preferred because of business relationship, cost, and MOQ. Sorry, what does MOQ stand for? I'm not sure what that. That's a difficult one. That is, I guess, probably when it comes to business relationships, you're probably talking about someone in a SLT at a higher level. You have to come up with a justification. If they're not willing to provide any of that information, you will expect, I'm sure they will be willing to complete a questionnaire. But then there has to be that justification of why you do not have a third-party audit or you're not allowed on site. And that justification will have to come from that business relationship and that business partner that's doing that. And put the onus on them. Minimum order quantity. Thank you. That can be the case, and I've seen it before where relationships can be made on the golf course, right? And there's a certain amount of that happens for sure. but then it's up to, because it's up to that business partner then to say, if we're going through this because of our business relationship, then they have to supply the justification as to why not having that.
Right.
That would be my answer to that. It's a tricky situation, but yeah.
And there's legal issues, right? If something happens, I mean, think about it. So, like, can you just give a few examples, if you can? What are some of the legal liabilities for a manufacturer if a supplier's product causes a compliance issue?
Well, it's your responsibility as a manufacturer to ensure that you're producing safe product.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in a scenario where it's because of a business relationship and something's not being met, then that's, again, where you need to get that justification from. But FDA can, if they see that you're receiving and using a high-risk ingredient and you're not performing the practices that they expect from you, like an on-site or audit report or that sort of thing, then they can issue you with a 483.
Right.
They can question why you're using it, and then if you cannot justify it, then that will end up with a 483. And that justification may be because of, as I said, if you have a certain amount of information, because there's more than an audit that you could get, and there's more than performing your own on-site audit. If regulatory authorities are involved there, that can be used, and maybe that's not there. But again, it comes down to that justification. But in the end of the day, if you don't have that, then the FDA can issue 483s and further if it's not fixed.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what happens then, if you're issued a 483, then your response will have to be, well, we either get that information or we cut them as a supplier, because it no longer matters about the business relationship. Would you rather be in business yourself or be shut down because of how somebody else feels about it?
Right. Yeah, it's tough, again, like you were saying, when you have a lot of suppliers, and of course, as you also mentioned, focus on those that are providing high risk ingredients, that sort of thing. But overall, it's very difficult to make sure everybody is kind of toeing the line.
Yeah.
I just wanted to circle back here, because you also talked about having your own questionnaire that you can send out around your specific requirements.
Yeah.
Would that questionnaire, if you say sent it out biannually or something like that, would that be a document that would be considered a proof document for compliance?
Yeah.
Okay.
As long as it's being completed by someone in the appropriate authority or proper knowledge within your supplier, then yes, it can be. And if they are not willing to provide an audit or have an audit performed, you can ask for more information on that questionnaire. You can ask a lot more details into their food safety plan, what control measures they have, how they perform their hazard analysis. Do they consider hazards such as biological, chemical, physical, radiological, intentional adulteration? Those are the sort of things to ensure that if they are signing off on this, and they're going to ensure that they have that, and if they don't, they'll say it, and that could be another reason for disqualification.
Right. Yeah, and again, as you pointed out, having regular communication times to just keep the lines of communication open, bringing in others in the organization if you need to, in order to get things moving again, just to make sure that your suppliers are aware of what your needs are, what the regulation changes might be, and then they're giving you information that you need in a timely manner. I do see another question regarding software. We're going to take that offline if you don't mind, but otherwise, I'm just going to thank you again, Sam. I think there's still a lot more to talk about on this topic, and I definitely would love to have you back to discuss this, but we're going to close it down for now and just share that if you guys have any questions whatsoever about food safety guidance, changes in FSMA, please talk to the folks over at the Acheson Group. They are the food safety experts around the globe. They work with food and beverage manufacturers every day, and they see it firsthand. They've lived and done this job, just like Sam had mentioned. They also have a podcast that you can check out. They run it a couple episodes every month, so do check out Tag Talks to get some latest food safety updates as well. You could also head on over to SafetyChain.com, where we have partnered with Tag to create some valuable food safety resources, things like the food traceability rule or even the intentional adulteration rule. You can go find some guides there. We also have videos and other food safety related content. So we all thank you very much. This has been a great FSMA Friday. We hope to see you next month, and we wish you a happy weekend ahead. Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you, Jim. Always a pleasure.
All right, everybody have a good rest of your day. Take care.